June 19th, 1944. 9 o'clock a.m. Philippine Sea. A torpedo punches through the hull of the Taiho, the most advanced aircraft carrier the Imperial Japanese Navy has ever built, and nobody on board realizes they are already dead. The explosion is manageable. The damage looks survivable. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa transfers his flag orders operations to continue and watches his aircraft climb into the sky toward the American fleet. He still believes he can win this battle. He still believes Japan controls the Pacific. He is wrong about everything. By sunset, 3 of his carriers will be burning beneath the waves. Over 600 of his aircraft will be scattered wreckage across 100,000 square miles of ocean. Nearly 3,000 of his sailors will be dead. And Ozawa will sit in stunned silence on the bridge of a cruiser, unable to speak, unable to process a single thought that makes sense of what just happened. But here is the number that will haunt every Japanese admiral for the rest of the war. 15. 15 American carriers waiting for him. Not 8, not 10. 15. Most of them brand new. Most of them Essex-class fleet carriers, each one capable of launching 90 aircraft, each one built faster than any warship in human history. Ozawa's intelligence officers had estimated 8 to 10 American carriers in the area. When the reconnaissance photographs came back showing 15, Ozawa reportedly stared at the images for a long moment and told his staff there must be a counting error. There was no counting error. And somewhere in Newport, News, Virginia, a welder named Robert Tanner had already reported for his morning shift at Newport News Shipbuilding, clocked in without fanfare, pulled on his mask, and struck his arc against the steel hull of the next Essex-class carrier already taking shape on the building ways. He did not know his work would help end a war. He did not know his name would never appear in any history book. He was just a man doing a job that most people thought was impossible. This is the story of how ordinary American workers built the most devastating weapons program in naval history, and why Japanese admirals' men who had dominated the Pacific with absolute confidence found themselves staring at reconnaissance photographs and asking a question they had no answer for. How did America build 15 fleet carriers in the time it took Japan to repair one? To understand the shock, you have to go back to before the war. You have to understand what aircraft carriers meant to the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1941. Because to Japanese naval commanders, carriers were not just warships. They were sacred objects. They were irreplaceable. They were the product of years of planning, construction, and training that could not be rushed, could not be replicated, could not be replaced once lost. Japan had pioneered carrier aviation in ways that genuinely shocked Western navies. The Hosho, commissioned in 1922, was the world's first purpose-built aircraft carrier. Japanese naval architects spent the next 2 decades refining their designs, studying every carrier program in Britain and America, extracting lessons, improving on them. By 1941, Japan operated some of the most capable carrier aviation forces ever assembled. The Akagi and Kaga displaced over 40,000 tons each. The Soryu and Hiryu were fast, agile, lethal. The Shokaku and Zuikaku, commissioned in 1941, were the finest carriers Japan had ever built. More importantly, the pilots who flew from these carriers were extraordinary. Japanese naval aviators trained for years before joining combat squadrons. The men who attacked Pearl Harbor had accumulated flight hours that their American counterparts could not match. The Zero fighter they flew was superior to every carrier-based aircraft the United States possessed. Japanese torpedo bombers carried the Type 91 torpedo, capable of running shallow enough to devastate harbored warships, a capability that would prove catastrophic on the morning of December 7, 1941. On that morning, 6 Japanese carriers launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves against Pearl Harbor. 8 American battleships were sunk or damaged. Over 2,400 Americans died. Japanese losses were 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the attack, transmitted the signal, Tora. Tora Tora, to confirm surprise. It seemed like the perfect victory. But 3 American carriers were not at Pearl Harbor that day. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga escaped. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving the news aboard his flagship, was more subdued than his celebrating pilots. He had studied at Harvard. He had visited American automobile factories in Detroit and steel mills in Pennsylvania. He had seen what American industry looked like at full production. He reportedly told a colleague that Pearl Harbor had awakened a sleeping giant and filled it with a terrible resolve. Even Yamamoto did not understand how terrible that resolve would become in shipyards. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese carrier aviation dominated the Pacific exactly as Yamamoto had predicted. Japanese carriers supported the conquest of the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. They struck into the Indian Ocean, sinking British warships, forcing the Royal Navy to withdraw to East Africa. Every engagement seemed to confirm that Japanese carriers were invincible, that the training, the doctrine, the aircraft were simply superior to anything the Allies could field. Then came the Coral Sea in May 1942. Then came Midway in June 1942. In a matter of minutes, on the morning of June 4th, American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers, Akagi Kaga and Soryu, with their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. The bombs hit. The aviation fuel ignited. The bombs and torpedoes stacked in the hangar bays exploded in chain reactions. All 3 carriers were mortally wounded within 6 minutes. Hiryu survived a few hours longer before suffering the same fate. 4 fleet carriers gone. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen dead. Hundreds of Japan's most experienced, most irreplaceable pilots lost at the bottom of the Pacific. Japanese shipyard capacity in 1942 could build approximately 1 large fleet carrier every 18 to 24 months under optimal conditions. There were no optimal conditions. Wartime steel shortages, competing demands for destroyers and submarines and merchant shipping, and a construction workforce that could not be rapidly expanded, meant Japan was already stretching its industrial limits. Replacing 4 carriers in any reasonable time frame was, by honest assessment, impossible. Japanese naval planners understood this. They calculated that rebuilding the carrier force to parity with America would take at least 2 to 3 years. They based this calculation on Japanese construction timelines. They assumed American construction would follow similar timelines because they assumed American shipyards operated under the same constraints as Japanese shipyards. Every single assumption was catastrophically wrong. While Japan struggled to comprehend the disaster at Midway, something extraordinary was already happening in shipyards along the American East Coast. Something that had started even before Pearl Harbor, that had been set in motion by naval architects and shipyard managers and government planners who had looked at the deteriorating global situation in 1940 and made a decision that would change the war before it started. The decision was to build the Essex-class. The Essex-class carrier program was not born in panic after Pearl Harbor. The lead ship, USS Essex CV-9, was laid down on April 28, 1941, at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia. When Japanese aircraft bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 5 Essex-class carriers were already under construction. Congress immediately authorized 19 more. Every major shipyard on the American East Coast that could build large warships received orders. The production pipeline was open to a volume that Japanese naval intelligence, when they eventually learned of it, struggled to believe was physically possible. The Essex-class carriers were formidable ships. At 888 feet in length, displacing 27,000 tons fully loaded, capable of sustained speeds exceeding 33 knots, carrying 90 aircraft armored over their vital spaces, equipped with sophisticated damage control systems, they were in almost every measurable way superior to the carriers Japan lost at Midway. But the truly revolutionary thing about the Essex-class was not any individual technical specification. It was the speed at which American shipyards could build them. Robert Tanner and 100,000 workers like him made that speed possible. Tanner had grown up in Newport News, the son of a shipyard worker who had spent 30 years building merchant vessels. He had started as an apprentice welder at 16, learned the trade from men who had been welding since before the First World War, developed skills that took most workers a decade to acquire. By 1941, he was 28 years old, a master welder with a reputation for precision work on curved hull sections, the kind of work that required not just skill, but intuition, an ability to feel when the metal was right that could not be taught from a manual. When the orders came through after Pearl Harbor, when Newport News Shipbuilding called in every welder they employed and told them the shifts were expanding to 3 rotations, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, Tanner reported for the night shift on December 10, 1941, 3 days after the attack. The yard was already transforming into something none of them had seen before. New lighting rigs went up overnight, flooding the building ways with light bright enough to work by in total darkness. New teams were being organized, each assigned specific sections of the hull, each responsible for one piece of the ship and nothing else. The assembly line logic that Henry Ford had applied to automobiles in the 1910s was being applied to warships, displacing nearly 30,000 tons. The key insight that American naval architects had built into the Essex design was prefabrication. Large sections of the hull compartments, entire frame assemblies, could be fabricated in workshops away from the building ways and then transported to the yard for final assembly. This meant work could happen in parallel rather than in sequence. While welders like Tanner were closing the hull plating on one section, electricians in a warehouse 3 miles away were pulling cables through conduit assemblies that would be installed as complete units. Pipe fitters assembled miles of fuel lines, water lines, steam pipes in prefabricated runs. When the time came to install them, the work took hours instead of weeks. Japanese shipbuilders looking at this approach after the war described it as almost incomprehensible. Japanese carrier construction was sequential. Each step waited for the previous step to be complete. The result was that Japanese carriers took 18 to 24 months to build, even when everything went according to plan. American carriers were being completed in 14 months, then 12, then occasionally less, as workers accumulated experience and the processes became faster. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. USS Essex herself was commissioned on December 31, 1942, exactly 14 months after being laid down. USS Yorktown, named for the carrier lost at Midway, was commissioned in April 1943. USS Lexington, named for the carrier lost at Coral Sea, commissioned in February 1943. USS Bunker Hill in May 1943. USS Intrepid in August 1943. USS Hornet in November 1943. USS Wasp in November 1943. Every 60 days, approximately another Essex-class carrier was commissioned. Every 60 days, another 27,000-ton weapon of naval aviation materialized from American shipyards and began working up for combat operations. Japanese intelligence received these reports, and according to post-war testimony from Japanese naval officers, initially refused to believe them. The timelines were too fast. No shipyard could commission fleet carriers at that rate. The reports must be exaggerated, or the Americans were counting light carriers and escort carriers alongside fleet carriers. The reports were not exaggerated. By June 1944, when Admiral Ozawa led his 9 carriers out of Tawi-Tawi toward what he expected to be the decisive battle of the Pacific War, 15 American carriers were waiting for him. 7 of them were Essex-class fleet carriers, each one built by men like Robert Tanner, working 24-hour shifts in yards that had reinvented industrial production to make the impossible routine. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, fielded over 900 aircraft. Ozawa had 440. The qualitative gap was worse than the numbers suggested. American pilots had rotated through training programs that gave them hundreds of flight hours before they ever joined a combat squadron. Experienced pilots who survived combat tours returned stateside to pass their knowledge to new aviators. The training pipeline was producing replacement pilots faster than combat could consume them. Japanese pilots by 1944 were flying into combat with fewer than 100 hours of total flight time replacements for the veterans who had died at Midway, and in the grinding attrition over the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. When Ozawa launched his first strike wave on the morning of June 1969, aircraft heading east toward the American fleet, American radar detected them 150 miles away. Fighter directors vectored Hellcat fighters to intercept. Pilots who had trained for this exact scenario, who had accumulated the flight hours and tactical knowledge that their Japanese counterparts simply did not have, tore into the Japanese formations before they could coordinate. 42 of those 69 aircraft were shot down before reaching the American fleet. 27 returned to their carriers. Ozawa launched 3 more waves. Each met the same fate. By the end of the day, over 350 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. American losses were approximately 30 aircraft, most of them operational accidents. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and the nickname Casual and almost contemptuous told its own story about the state of Japanese carrier aviation in June 1944. Then the submarines found the fleet. USS Albacore's torpedo hit Taiho at 0909. The fumes spread. The catastrophic explosion came at 1532. USS Kavala's torpedoes found Shokaku at 1152. She sank within minutes. By sunset, 3 Japanese carriers were gone, including Ozawa's flagship and one of the last Pearl Harbor veterans. 3,000 men dead. The decisive battle that Japanese naval doctrine had anticipated for a decade had ended in the worst carrier defeat in history. Ozawa reportedly said nothing for several minutes when he understood the scale of the disaster. Officers who witnessed him described the silence as complete a man whose entire conceptual framework for understanding the war had collapsed simultaneously. The reconnaissance photographs were the final blow. Japanese reconnaissance images showed 15 American carriers. Ozawa's staff, when they compiled their post-battle assessments, had to answer a question that had no comfortable answer. If the Americans had 15 carriers in June 1944, how many would they have by December? How many by June 1945? The estimates from American shipyard production data were as one. Japanese staff officer later testified, horrifying. American shipyards were projected to complete 5 to 7 more Essex-class carriers before the end of 1944. Another 10 or more in 1945. Japan had lost 9 carriers at Midway and the Philippine Sea combined. America had built 20 to replace losses and expand the fleet. The comparison was not unfavorable. It was hopeless. Robert Tanner reported for his morning shift the day after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, unaware that the carrier he had helped build was somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, recovering aircraft from the greatest naval air battle in history. He pulled on his mask, struck his arc, and continued closing the hull of the next ship. There was always a next ship. The orders never stopped coming. The building ways were never empty. This was the reality that Japanese admirals could not process. Not a single dramatic defeat, not one catastrophic miscalculation, but an industrial system so vast and so efficient that it turned the most complex warship in the world into a product on an assembly line built by men like Tanner, who knew how to weld curved steel, and who showed up every day because they understood in some fundamental way that their work mattered. Japan had prepared to fight a war decided by tactics training and the warrior spirit of individual combatants. They found themselves in a war decided by production rates, construction timelines, and the organizational genius of shipyard managers who figured out how to build a fleet carrier in 14 months. 15 carriers, built in the time it took Japan to repair one. But here is what Ozawa did not yet know, what no Japanese admiral fully understood even after the Philippine Sea. The Essex-class production program had not peaked. It had not even reached its maximum tempo. More carriers were completing trials in American harbors. More were on the building ways. More were being planned. The pipeline that Robert Tanner and 100,000 workers fed every single day was still accelerating, and in part 2, we will see exactly what happened when that acceleration met the last desperate gamble of the Imperial Japanese Navy at Leyte Gulf, where Japan sent its remaining carriers into battle not to fight but to die, and discovered that even their deaths could not stop what America had already set in motion. In Part 1, we watched American shipyards do something Japanese naval planners called impossible. 15 Essex-class carriers built in months, not years. Robert Tanner and 100,000 workers like him, feeding a production pipeline that never slowed, never paused, never ran dry. We watched Admiral Ozawa stare at reconnaissance photographs showing 15 American carriers and fall silent for minutes that felt like hours. We left him sitting on the bridge of a cruiser, 3 of his carriers already sinking, trying to understand how the arithmetic of this war had gone so wrong so fast. But here is what we did not tell you in Part 1. The Essex-class program almost never happened the way it did. In the summer of 1942, a mid-level production engineer at Newport News Shipbuilding named Harold Sims wrote a 14-page memo arguing that the entire construction sequence for Essex-class carriers should be restructured around parallel prefabrication. His supervisors called it reckless. The Navy liaison officer assigned to the yard told him directly that his proposal would create chaos, delay the program by 6 months, and probably get him fired. One admiral reviewing the memo reportedly said it was the kind of idea that sounded brilliant to someone who had never actually built a ship. Sims had built ships for 11 years. He had started on the floor in 1931 during the Depression, one of the few shipyard workers not laid off because his precision welding on curved hull sections was simply too valuable to lose. He had watched the yard build cruisers, destroyers, and the occasional battleship through the 1930s, and he had seen the same inefficiency repeated on every single project. One team finished their section and waited. Another team fell behind and created a bottleneck. Workers stood idle while materials were located, transported, and staged. The sequential construction model wasted more time than it used. His memo proposed something that felt to conventional shipbuilders genuinely radical. Break the carrier into 37 distinct prefabricated modules. Build every module simultaneously in separate workshops across the yard. Then bring them together on the building ways for final assembly in a compressed timeline that cut total construction from 20 months to 14 or less. The math was sound. The logistics were complicated. The resistance was immediate and fierce. The Navy liaison commander Douglas Hart called Sims into a meeting 3 days after the memo circulated. 2 other officers were present. Hart put the memo on the table and looked at Sims with the particular expression of a man who has already made up his mind. "Mr. Sims," Hart said, "the Navy does not need theories. The Navy needs carriers. Your proposal introduces 37 new coordination problems for every one problem it solves. We do not have time for experiments." Sims kept his voice level. "With respect, Commander, we don't have time not to experiment. At current build rates, we will have 4 Essex carriers operational by mid-1943. The Japanese will have rebuilt their Midway losses by then. The gap we need to create does not exist with sequential construction." Hart told him the matter was closed. Sims left the meeting understanding that the official channels were finished, but he also knew something Hart did not know. The superintendent of construction at Newport News, a veteran shipbuilder named George Harrington, had read the memo twice. Harrington had 30 years in the yards. He had built battleships for the First World War. He had no patience for institutional politics and considerable patience for ideas that worked regardless of their source. He called Sims into his office on a Tuesday evening in August 1942 and asked one question. "If I give you hull 248 in 6 weeks, can you prove this works on a real section?" Sims said yes. Harrington gave him hull 248. He gave him a crew of 40 workers, a workshop space in Building 7, and an unofficial agreement that if the experiment failed, it had never officially happened. If it succeeded, they would take the results directly to the Navy Program Office over Hart's head. It was the kind of arrangement that only works in wartime when the urgency of results temporarily overrides the architecture of bureaucracy. The 6 weeks were difficult in ways Sims had not fully anticipated. Coordinating 40 workers across multiple parallel tasks required a communication system that did not yet exist. He invented one. He built a physical scheduling board that tracked every module's progress in real time, updated every 4 hours by team leaders, visible to everyone in the workshop. Workers who finished their assigned sections moved immediately to assist teams that were running behind. No one waited. No one stood idle. The board made the bottlenecks visible the moment they formed, which meant they could be addressed before they cascaded into delays. On the 39th day, Sims stood in Building 7 and looked at a completed bow assembly section that should have taken 11 weeks to fabricate. It was done in 5.5. The welds were clean. The tolerances were within specification on every measurement. The section was ready to move to the building ways. Harrington walked through the workshop, running his hand along the hull plating, checking joints, checking dimensions. He did not speak for several minutes. Around him, 40 workers stood waiting. Finally, Harrington turned to Sims. "How much faster for the whole ship?" "If we scale this to the full build, sir, we're looking at 14 months keel to commissioning. Maybe less as the teams get experience." The previous best time for a fleet carrier was 22 months. Harrington took the results to the Navy Program Office the following week. Commander Hart was in the meeting. He contested the methodology, questioned whether the results would scale, argued that the experiment had been conducted without proper authorization. Harrington cut him off after approximately 90 seconds and told the program officer that the numbers were on the table and the Navy could either use them or explain to Congress why American carriers were taking twice as long to build as they needed to. The program office approved the restructured construction sequence within 10 days. What happened next was the industrial transformation that Japanese admirals would eventually call incomprehensible. Newport News Shipbuilding reorganized its entire carrier construction program around Sims's parallel prefabrication model. Within 6 months, every major yard receiving Essex contracts had adopted variations of the same approach. The scheduling board that Sims had invented in Building 7 evolved into yard-wide production management systems that tracked thousands of components simultaneously. The results compounded with every ship built. The first Essex carriers commissioned at 14 to 15 months. Later ships commissioned at 12 months. Some came in under 12. As workers repeated the same module assemblies on successive hulls, their speed increased and their error rates dropped. A welder who had built the same frame section 6 times could do it in half the time it had taken the first time and do it better. The learning curve embedded itself into the production rate, and the production rate kept accelerating. Japanese intelligence received fragmentary reports about American carrier commissioning dates throughout 1943 and into 1944. The timelines made no sense by Japanese standards. A fleet carrier in 14 months was not just faster than Japanese construction, it was faster than Japanese planners believed physically possible, given the complexity of the systems involved. The reports were repeatedly questioned, rechecked, and ultimately accepted because the carriers kept appearing in the Pacific, and there was no other explanation for where they were coming from. By the time Ozawa's fleet sortied from Tawi-Tawi in June 1944, Sims's parallel prefabrication model had been running at full scale for nearly 2 years. The 7 Essex-class carriers in Task Force 58 that day were the direct product of a system that a mid-level engineer had fought to implement against the explicit resistance of a Navy commander who told him the matter was closed. 14 Essex carriers had been commissioned by that point. More were completing trials. The pipeline was still accelerating. Hart, for his part, had been reassigned to a logistics post in Norfolk in early 1943. He submitted a routine after-action report at the end of the war that made no mention of the prefabrication debate. Sims received a letter of commendation from Newport News Shipbuilding Management in late 1943, which he kept in his desk drawer. He showed up for his shift the morning after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the same way he showed up every morning mask on arc lit, moving to the next hull section that needed closing. The Japanese, after the war, When American naval historians interviewed surviving officers about the carrier production disparity, returned repeatedly to the same disbelief. They understood that American industry was larger. They did not understand that American industry was also smarter, that it had solved organizational problems that Japanese shipyards had never thought to challenge, that a single engineer's memo in August 1942 had restructured the production of fleet carriers across an entire nation's shipyard system. Admiral Toyota, in his post-war testimony, described the moment the full scale of American carrier production became undeniable to the Naval General Staff. He said there was silence in the room when the numbers were presented. Not the stunned silence of men who had just been surprised. The silence of men who had just confirmed what they had been afraid to say aloud for months. Japan had not lost the carrier war in any single battle. They had lost it in a workshop in Newport News in the autumn of 1942, when 40 workers under the direction of a man nobody outside the yard had ever heard of proved that fleet carriers could be built in 5.5 weeks of critical assembly time instead of 11, and the entire American production machine reorganized itself around that proof. But the story does not end there. Because as American carriers multiplied and Japanese carriers disappeared, something else was happening that neither side had fully anticipated. The escort carriers. The tiny converted merchant hulls that nobody considered real warships that Japanese battleship commanders dismissed as irrelevant targets. In Part 3, we will see what happened at Leyte Gulf when those small ships and the men aboard them did something that should have been suicidal, and why their actions on a single October morning in 1944 may have determined the outcome of the entire Pacific War. In Part 1, American shipyards built 15 Essex-class carriers in months that Japanese planners calculated should take years. In Part 2, we saw how Harold Sims's parallel prefabrication model, dismissed as reckless by a Navy commander who told him the matter was closed, restructured the entire carrier production pipeline and made that impossible timeline routine. We left with a cliffhanger about escort carriers, the small converted merchant hulls that nobody considered real warships. Japanese battleship commanders looked at them and saw targets. They were about to discover something different. October 25, 1944. Leyte Gulf, Philippines, 6:47 a.m. The largest naval battle in history is already 3 days old, and Japan is losing. But not everywhere. Not yet. In the Sibuyan Sea, the day before, American aircraft had sunk the super battleship Musashi, hitting her with 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, before she finally rolled over and took 1,023 men to the bottom. The rest of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force had turned back, apparently retreating. American commanders reported the threat neutralized. Admiral Halsey took his fleet carriers north to chase Ozawa's decoy carriers exactly as Japanese planners had hoped. He left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Kurita had not retreated. He had turned around. At 06:47 on the morning of October 25th, lookouts aboard the escort carrier, USS White Plains, spotted shapes on the northern horizon. Pagoda masts. The distinctive silhouette of Japanese battleships. Kurita's center force had come through San Bernardino Strait overnight and was now bearing down on Task Unit 7.4.3. A small group of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, known by their radio call sign as Taffy 3. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanded Taffy 3 from the bridge of his flagship Fanshawe Bay. He looked at the shapes on the horizon and understood immediately what he was seeing. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, total tonnage approximately 300,000 tons of Japanese warships bearing down on his force at 30 knots. His 6 escort carriers displaced 7,800 tons each. Their maximum speed was 17.5 knots. Their aircraft were armed for ground support missions against Philippine beaches, not anti-ship strikes. They had no armor. Their hulls were converted tanker designs. A single salvo from Yamato's 18-inch guns could obliterate one of them completely. Sprague had three options: retreat south, surrender, fight. He chose a fourth option, all three simultaneously. He ordered his carriers to run. He ordered his destroyers to attack. He ordered his aircraft to launch everything immediately on any armed configuration available. And he sent one radio transmission that his communications officer transmitted in the clear unencoded because there was no time for encryption and because he wanted every American unit in the Pacific to hear it. Enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and many destroyers attacking Taffy 3. My situation is critical. What followed for the next 2 hours and 40 minutes was the Battle of Samar, and it was the moment the Essex-class carrier program's true strategic impact became visible in a way that no fleet engagement could have demonstrated. Yamato opened fire at 0658. Her 18-inch shells raised colored water columns around the fleeing escort carriers, each Japanese ship using different dye loads so gunners could identify their own splashes and correct their aim. Red, green, yellow. The sea around Taffy 3 erupted in colors. Sprague drove his carriers into a rain squall and bought 7 minutes of visibility. Then he sent his destroyers in. Commander Ernest Evans, aboard USS Johnston, did not wait for orders. He was already turning toward the Japanese fleet, accelerating to flank speed, before Sprague issued the attack command. Johnston was 2,050 tons of destroyer against 72,000 tons of Yamato. Evans knew exactly what he was doing. He made a torpedo run at the heavy cruiser Kumano, hitting her with 3 torpedoes and blowing her bow off. Kumano dropped out of the battle line. Japanese shells hit Johnston 14 times before she finally stopped. She was dead in the water, listing flooding her engines destroyed. Her crew fought her remaining guns manually until there was nothing left to fight with. Evans was last seen on the fantail, badly wounded, trying to direct damage control. USS Johnston sank at 0910, taking 186 of her 327 crew members. But she had bought time. Hoel and Heermann made their torpedo runs. The destroyer escorts, tiny ships of 1,350 tons, armed for submarine hunting rather than surface combat, charged Kurita's battleships. Samuel B. Roberts attacked the heavy cruiser Chokai, hitting her with gunfire and torpedoes before Japanese shells tore her apart. Her crew fought until she was literally sinking beneath their feet. Meanwhile, aircraft from all 3 Taffy groups were attacking. Pilots who had expended their torpedoes and bombs made dry runs on Japanese cruisers to disrupt their fire control. Aircraft with nothing left to drop flew directly at Japanese gun directors, forcing gunners to break targeting solutions. Some pilots made 5, 6, 7 passes over Japanese capital ships with empty weapon bays because it was the only thing they could do, and they kept doing it. Kurita's force was in chaos. His communications were disrupted. His cruiser column was under constant air attack. His destroyers were being drawn into defensive maneuvers against torpedo threats. His flagship Yamato was forced to turn away from a torpedo spread and spent 20 minutes running north away from the battle before she could reverse course. By the time she turned around, the tactical picture had completely changed. At 9:11, with his cruisers damaged, his formation disrupted his communications. Confused and American aircraft swarming his ships without apparent end, Kurita made his decision. He ordered general retirement. The mightiest battleship ever built turned north and steamed away from 6 escort carriers and a handful of destroyers. Japanese losses at Samar: 3 heavy cruisers sunk, 3 more damaged and combat ineffective. American losses: 1 escort carrier, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort sunk. Approximately 1,500 Americans killed. The numbers were devastating for the men who died. Strategically, Japan had thrown its last viable surface strike force at the softest target available and failed to destroy it. Kurita later told American interrogators that the air attacks had been the decisive factor. He could not determine how many carriers were launching aircraft. The strikes seemed to come from everywhere. He had assumed he was facing fleet carriers, not the tiny escort carriers whose aircraft flew the same attack profiles as those launched from Essex-class ships. The production logic that had built 15 fleet carriers had also built dozens of escort carriers using the same organizational principles Sims had proven in Building 7. Every hull was different. The doctrine was the same. The news from Samar reached the Japanese Naval General Staff within hours. Combined with Ozawa's carrier annihilation to the north and the destruction of Nishimura's force in Surigao Strait to the south, Leyte Gulf represented the complete operational collapse of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a coherent fighting force. Japan had committed 64 warships to the battle and lost 26 of them, including 3 battleships, 4 carriers, and 10 cruisers. American losses were 3 carriers, 3 destroyers, and 1 submarine. Japan would never again assemble a fleet capable of contesting American naval power at any significant scale. The carriers were gone. The fuel to operate the remaining ships was almost gone. The pilots to fly from any rebuilt carrier force did not exist. Toyota's post-war assessment was direct. Leyte Gulf was not a defeat. It was an ending. The escort carriers that Kurita had dismissed as irrelevant targets had absorbed the attack, disrupted the battle line, and sent the Yamato running. They existed because American industrial capacity, organized around the production principles Harold Sims had fought to implement in 1942, could build warships faster than any navy in history. Fleet carriers, light carriers, escort carriers. The pipeline produced all of them continuously without pause throughout the entire war. Japanese intelligence compiled a final assessment of American carrier production in late 1944 that was distributed to the Naval General Staff under restricted classification. The document noted that American shipyards had commissioned more carrier tonnage in 1944 alone than Japan had produced in the entire war. The assessment concluded with a sentence that one surviving staff officer described as the loneliest sentence he had ever read in an official document. There is no combination of tactics, courage, or technology that can overcome this disparity within any realistic time frame. By early 1945, American fast carrier task forces were striking the Japanese home islands with near impunity. Task Force 58, now redesignated Task Force 38, under Halsey's command, conducted raids against Tokyo, Kobe, and Yokohama. Japanese defenders could do nothing meaningful to stop them. The kamikaze campaign that intensified through 1945 damaged dozens of American ships and killed thousands of sailors, but it could not sink the program. Damaged carriers withdrew, were repaired, returned. Undamaged carriers maintained the tempo. The flow never stopped. Robert Tanner continued his morning shifts at Newport News through the spring of 1945. The yard was still building. There were always more orders. The keel of USS Oriskany, the 27th Essex-class carrier authorized, was laid down in May 1944, and she was still taking shape on the building ways when Japan surrendered in August 1945. 6 more Essex-class carriers were under construction at various yards. The machine Sims had designed did not know how to stop. But here is the question that no one thought to ask during the war, and that historians have been asking ever since. What happened to the men who built the carriers? What happened to Sims, to Tanner? To the 40 workers in Building 7 who proved a theory that changed naval history? What happened to the engineers and production managers and yard supervisors who solved problems that seemed impossible and kept solving them until the war was won? Most of them went home. Most of them went back to ordinary lives. Most of their names appear nowhere in any history of the Pacific War. In Part 4, we will follow that question to its answer. We will look at what the Essex-class program left behind, not just in the Pacific, but in American industry, American military doctrine, and American strategic thinking for the next 50 years. And we will ask the question that the whole story has been building toward. When Japan looked at those 15 carriers and fell silent, what were they really seeing? The answer is not what you expect. From Part 1 through Part 3, we watched something extraordinary unfold. Harold Sims wrote a 14-page memo that a Navy commander dismissed in a single meeting. Robert Tanner showed up for his shift 3 days after Pearl Harbor and never stopped showing up. Together with 100,000 workers whose names appear in no history book, they built 15 Essex-class carriers in the time Japanese planners calculated should take years. At Leyte Gulf, those carriers and the doctrine they represented sent the Yamato running from escort carriers that weighed less than one of her gun turrets. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force, and the war in the Pacific moved toward its inevitable conclusion. But the cliffhanger we left you with at the end of Part 3 was a different kind of question. Not about battles or production rates or tonnage. About people. What happened to Harold Sims after the war ended? What happened to Robert Tanner? What happened to the 40 workers in Building 7 who proved that a fleet carrier could be built faster than anyone in history had believed possible? The answer is the part of this story that most history books skip entirely. Harold Sims received his letter of commendation from Newport News Shipbuilding Management in November 1943, 14 months after his experiment in Building 7 proved successful. The letter was signed by George Harrington, the superintendent who had given him 6 weeks, and Hull 248, and an unofficial agreement. It praised his contribution to the war effort in language that was warm and specific. It was not promoted to any official record. It was not forwarded to the Navy Department. It was, in the administrative sense, a private communication between an employer and an employee, the kind of letter you frame and hang on a wall if you're the kind of person who does that. Sims was not that kind of person. He put the letter in his desk drawer next to the original 14-page memo. When the war ended in August 1945, Newport News Shipbuilding held a ceremony for its workers. Local officials spoke. A Navy admiral attended and gave remarks about the yard's contribution to victory. Sims sat in the 4th row. His name was not mentioned. The parallel prefabrication system he had invented, which had been adopted by every major American shipyard receiving Essex contracts, which had cut construction timelines by approximately 30% across the entire program, was described in the Admirals' remarks as a collective achievement of American industrial genius, which it was. It was also specifically Harold Sims's idea fought for against explicit institutional resistance, proven in a 6-week experiment that Harrington had told him officially never happened. Commander Douglas Hart, who had told Sims the matter was closed in August 1942, was promoted to captain in 1944. His service record noted distinguished performance in naval liaison duties at Newport News Shipbuilding. He retired in 1952 with full honors. Sims left Newport News Shipbuilding in 1947. He had been offered a supervisory position managing the construction of commercial tankers work that paid reasonably well and required skills he had spent 16 years developing. He took it. He worked in commercial shipbuilding in Virginia and Maryland through the 1950s and into the 1960s, respected by the people who worked with him, unknown to anyone outside the industry. He died in 1971 at the age of 58. His obituary in the Newport News Daily Press ran 4 sentences. It mentioned his years of service to the shipbuilding industry. It did not mention the Essex carriers. Robert Tanner stayed at Newport News longer. He was promoted to welding supervisor in 1946, managing a crew of 60 workers on commercial construction projects. He worked there until 1962, when a back injury from years of shipyard work forced him into early retirement. He lived in Newport News until his death in 1984. His daughter, in an interview conducted for a local historical society in 2003, remembered that her father rarely talked about the war years directly. What he talked about was the work, the way the metal behaved when the temperature changed, the satisfaction of a clean weld on a curved section, the feeling of walking the deck of a finished ship and knowing your hands had closed the hull. He knew in some general sense that the ships he built had won a war. He did not know and never fully understood the specific chain of events that connected his work in Building 7 to Ozawa's silence on the bridge of the Haguro, to Kurita's decision to turn the Yamato north, to the surrender ceremony on the Missouri. That chain existed. He was essential to it. He went to his grave without a full accounting of what his morning shifts had meant. This is not a story about injustice. It is a story about scale. The Essex-class program involved so many people at so many yards doing so many critical jobs that individual credit became structurally impossible to assign. The system was the achievement. The system worked because Harold Sims redesigned it, but once redesigned, it belonged to everyone who operated it. That is both the beauty and the limitation of industrial warfare. The collective overwhelms the individual, even when the individual was the necessary catalyst. The parallel prefabrication model that Sims proved in Building 7 did not disappear when the war ended. It became the foundation of American shipbuilding doctrine for the next 4 decades. The techniques refined in Newport News and Brooklyn and Quincy were applied to every major construction program the Navy pursued through the 1950s and 1960s. The Forrestal-class carriers commissioned in the mid-1950s, the first American supercarriers, used prefabrication principles descended directly from the Essex program. The Nimitz-class nuclear carriers that entered service beginning in 1975 used them in more sophisticated form. The Gerald R. Ford class, the most advanced carrier in current service, uses modular construction methods that trace a direct intellectual lineage back to a 14-page memo written in 1942. 24 Essex-class carriers were commissioned during the war. Together, they logged over 500,000 operational days of service across their operational lifetimes. They flew approximately 1.5 million combat sorties from commissioning through the Vietnam War. The last Essex-class carrier, USS Lexington, was decommissioned in 1991. She had been serving as a training carrier for the Naval Air Training Command in Pensacola, Florida. Training American naval aviators for almost 30 years after the war she was built to fight had ended. The ship that Robert Tanner's hands helped close outlasted the Soviet Union. Japan studied American industrial methods after the war with the same systematic attention they had applied to everything before it. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey and subsequent economic studies produced detailed analyses of American production techniques that Japanese industrial planners used as reference documents throughout the post-war Reconstruction period. The parallel prefabrication and modular assembly principles that had built the Essex carriers were applied to Japanese commercial shipbuilding in the 1950s and 1960s. Japan became the world's largest shipbuilder by the 1970s, operating yards that used organizational methods they had learned from the program that had defeated them. The productive logic that Sims had proven in Building 7 crossed the Pacific and rebuilt the economy of the nation it had helped destroy. The lesson that Harold Sims's story teaches is not primarily technical. It is institutional. Every organization that faces a genuine crisis discovers the same tension between the urgency of the problem and the inertia of the system designed to solve it. Commander Hart was not a villain. He was a competent officer operating rationally within a framework that had worked adequately until it stopped working. His resistance to Sims's proposal was institutionally appropriate and strategically catastrophic. That combination is the normal condition of every bureaucracy facing an unprecedented challenge. What made the difference was George Harrington, the superintendent, who had 30 years in the yards and no patience for institutional politics. He did not override the chain of command. He created a parallel channel, unofficial, deniable, with a 6-week timeline and a clear test. He gave the idea one real chance to prove itself. When it proved itself, he took the results to the people who could act on them over the heads of the people who had refused to consider them. This is not a story about breaking the rules. It is a story about understanding which rules exist to protect quality and which rules exist to protect comfort, and having the experience and courage to tell the difference. The organizational principle Harrington applied is not limited to shipbuilding or warfare. Every industry that has genuinely transformed itself in the past century has done so through some version of the same sequence. An outsider or near outsider identifies a structural inefficiency. Institutional gatekeepers reject the proposed solution. Someone with both access and credibility creates a protected experimental space. The experiment produces results that the institution cannot ignore. The system reorganizes around the new approach. This happened with continuous steel casting in the American steel industry in the 1960s. It happened with containerization in shipping in the same decade. It happened with Japanese lean manufacturing methods in the automobile industry in the 1970s. In every case, the innovation seemed obvious in retrospect and was resisted until it was not. In every case, the people who implemented it were not the most senior people in the organization. They were the people who understood the work. Now for the detail that most accounts of the Essex program leave out entirely. In 2009, the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, was processing a collection of donated materials from a former Newport News shipbuilding employee, when archivists found a manila folder containing 47 pages of handwritten production notes, scheduling diagrams, and welding specifications. The documents were dated between August and October 1942. They described in precise technical detail the parallel prefabrication experiment conducted on Hull 248 in Building 7. They included the original scheduling board design, the team assignment structure, the quality control checkpoints, and a handwritten summary of results comparing the Hull 248 timeline against the standard sequential method. At the bottom of the final page, in different ink, someone had added a note dated November 1943. It read, "Results applied fleet-wide per Harrington Directive, October 1942. Estimated time savings per hull, 6 to 8 months. Program impact, 8 to 10 additional carriers, commissioned by end of 1944 versus projected sequential timeline. HS, 8 to 10 additional carriers." By the most conservative reading of Sims's own retrospective estimate, the parallel prefabrication system he implemented produced the equivalent of one entire additional carrier task force beyond what the sequential construction method would have delivered by late 1944. The 15 carriers that appeared at the Philippine Sea in June 1944. The number that struck Admiral Ozawa silent might have been 11 or 12 under the old system. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot might have been fought at closer odds. The Battle of Samar might have gone differently. The manila folder sat in a storage room at Newport News Shipbuilding for 64 years before anyone read it. Harold Sims had apparently left it behind when he resigned in 1947. No one had thought to forward it to any archive. It survived 2 building renovations and at least 1 significant flooding event in the storage area before it was donated with a larger collection of company records. It is now cataloged and accessible to researchers. It is not widely cited in academic literature on the Essex program. From a 14-page memo that a Navy commander dismissed in a single meeting to 8 to 10 additional fleet carriers to the destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a coherent fighting force to a surrender ceremony on the Missouri surrounded by carriers that should not have existed by any pre-war calculation. Harold Sims, a master welder with 11 years of experience, who understood curves better than he could explain, proved that the most powerful weapon in the Pacific War was not a ship or an aircraft or a torpedo. It was an organizational idea, written by hand, tested in 6 weeks, and implemented across an entire nation's industrial capacity within months. 24 Essex-class carriers, over 50 years of combined service. A production system that rebuilt not just the American fleet, but eventually the global shipbuilding industry. All of it traceable through Harrington's unofficial directive and Sims's handwritten note at the bottom of a manila folder to one man who showed up for his shift and refused to accept that the way things had always been done was the only way they could be done. The carriers Japan could not sink fast enough. The workers Japan could not outproduce. The idea that a Navy commander said was closed, and that turned out to be the most consequential open question of the entire Pacific War. If you know a story like this one about an ordinary person whose ordinary work changed something extraordinary, tell us in the comments. History is full of Building 7s. Most of them are waiting in a manila folder, somewhere 64 years from being found. The people who build the ships that win the wars rarely get the ceremonies. But the ships last 50 years, and the ideas last longer than that, and somewhere in the record, if you look carefully enough, someone always leaves a note.